This video attempts to briefly review the hobby of highpointing and to illustrate differences between country, state, and county highpointing. A general definition is that highpointers try to find and visit the highest natural ground in a given area or territory. But there is a great deal of specialization within the highpointing community. Some highpointers primarily visit the highest point in each country, while others attempt to visit the highest point in each U.S. state or territory. According to the United Nations, there are 195 countries in the world. In the United States, there are 50 states, 6 inhabited territories, and 9 uninhabited territories that can be visited. Then there are others that primarily seek the high point of each county in the United States. According to peakbagger.com, there are 3,142 counties or county equivalents in the United States, plus the District of Columbia. Others prefer to visit the highest natural ground in each national or state park, and yes, there are a few that prefer to visit city or town high points. Regardless of the type of high point you pursue, there are 5 concerns that must be addressed before you begin this hobby. Number 1. Do you know the exact location of the high point? Number 2. Is there more than one location that must be visited to claim the high point? Number 3. Do you need permission to visit the area? You don't want to trespass. 4. How much physical effort will it take to visit the high point? And finally, 5. How much will it cost to visit the high point? Let's begin by looking at a few easy-to-visit country high points. We begin with the Netherlands. Valserberg is the highest point in the country of Netherlands at over 1,000 feet above sea level. This narrow cylinder sits on the land where the 3 countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany all come together. Close by, there is a tall observation tower and a very large maze that you can get yourself lost in quite easily. Drive on down the road and you will come to Signal de Botrange, where the highest natural ground in Belgium exists at 694 meters. What's interesting about Belgium is in 1934, government officials decided that they wanted the high point of their country to be 700 meters, not 694. So they constructed a stairway to nowhere that went up another 6 meters, and at the top of this 6-meter stairway, they placed a large stone with 700 meters emblazoned into it and claimed this is the high point of Belgium. So much for the Belgians. Drive on down the road a little farther and you'll come to Bergplatz, which is the high ground in Luxembourg. At least that's where virtually all the Luxembourgians believe the high point is located. What they do not realize is that about 30 years ago, a very careful survey revealed that there was this very modest little stone that barely protrudes next to a very narrow farm lane called the Knief, was exactly 1 meter higher than the land at Bergplatz. So if you visit the Knief, you'll visit an area that virtually no one in Luxembourg knows is the true high point. If you'd like to visit a real alpine peak, consider the Zugspitze, the high point of Germany. This is a real alpine climb if you decide to visit it that way. But there are 3 easier ways to reach the top. You can take a train or a gondola from the German side, or a gondola from the Austrian side of the mountain. Each of these alternate routes will deposit you only about 100 vertical feet from the top. You can then climb an iron ladder that's firmly bolted to the cliff to reach the high point area, where there is a tremendous view of the Alps. Halfway around the world, you may want to visit the high point of the city of Hong Kong, known as Victoria Peak. There is a funicular there that says this train goes to the top of Victoria Peak, but don't go there unless you enjoy shopping, because it will deposit you in the col to the right at a humongous shopping mall. To visit the true top of Victoria Peak, you'll need to either walk or take a taxi up to these towers that crown the top of the mountain, and you can hike to the fence that surrounds these topmost towers and get a fantastic view of the bay and the city. One more country high point is the high point of Wales, known as Snowdon. This is another challenging hike if you decide to actually walk up this mountain, but there is a train that you can take that will deposit you within 100 feet of the top. On the day that I visited, the wind was blowing at more than 50 miles an hour, and you could barely stand up without being blown over by the winds at the top of this peak. These are easy to visit country high points. Let's now examine some state high points here in the United States. We'll begin with Mount Arvon, which is in the state of Michigan. 50 years ago, the high point in the state of Michigan was called Summit Peak. It's located over in the Porcupine Mountains in the Upper Peninsula. About 45 years ago, they determined that there was another peak called Mount Curwood that was about 100 miles east of there, which was a little bit higher, and that remained the high point of the state until about 1990, when some Eagle Scouts hiking in the woods came back and claimed that they had found a peak a little bit higher on Mount Arvon. They convinced the state surveyor to go up and to check the elevation, and he agreed with them. He came back and said, yes, Mount Arvon is 10 inches higher than Mount Curwood. So since 1990, Mount Arvon has been the official state high point in Michigan. I first climbed Mount Arvon in 1992, and at that time, it was a very difficult climb. You had to go through several miles of old dirt log roads and ended up wading through creeks and swamps and battling your way through briars and brush. There were no trails, there were no roads anywhere near the top. I went back just a couple of years ago and discovered that now there's been a four-wheel drive road that's been constructed to within a few hundred feet of the top. You can drive up there, picnic on the picnic table, sign the register that's kept in the mailbox, and sit on this bench and enjoy the view of the sign that says, you're at Mount Arvon, the highest spot in Michigan. At least it's the highest spot at the moment. Another state high point is Mount Greylock in Massachusetts. This is a real mountain in the Berkshire Hills at an elevation of almost 3,500 feet above sea level. You can drive to the top and visit this impressive war memorial that looks like a lighthouse. Another interesting state high point is Mount Sunflower in Kansas. This slight rise out on the high plains has been fenced off. The rancher has planted some sunflowers there and put in some iron artwork. And from about a half a mile away, he will invite you to walk in if you don't mind walking amongst the cattle on his ranch. A similar situation exists at Panorama Point, which is the state high point of Nebraska. This is over a mile above sea level, and you will note the piping that surrounds the monument there. This is located inside a buffalo preserve, and the buffalo like to scratch themselves and rub on anything that protrudes up, and they've knocked over the monument a couple of times, and so that's why they put the piping around it. Once again, you have to stop some distance away from this monument. The rancher there will allow you to go in, but warns you that if you see any bison wandering around, that you should be very careful and not approach them. If you're looking for a challenging peak to climb, consider Guadalupe Peak in western Texas. There is a 4.5-mile trail that rises 3,000 vertical feet to the top of this mountain, which has a very impressive view of western Texas. Along the way, you will see many fossils in the rocks in the pathway, but do not collect them. You're inside a national park, so you can look at the fossils, but you cannot collect them. Another state high point that I really enjoy is Mount Hood in the state of Oregon. This snow-capped volcano is one of the early places that I trained my children how to hike on snow. Here's my daughter working her way up the Hogback, headed toward the Bergschrund and the Pearly Gates off to the right. Another mountain that is a state high point, as well as a national park high point, is Mount Rainier in Washington. I've been fortunate enough to climb this mountain 3 times. The very first time I climbed in 1993, the picture at the lower left, I was standing on the snow dome, which was clearly the high point at that time. Since then, the snow dome has shrunk some 9 to 10 feet due to global warming, and today the high point is near the rocks on the snow dome behind my left shoulder. Notice that most of the country high points and most of the state high points are fairly well known. People know where they are, and many people that go to that area are going specifically to visit those high points. We do not have that situation when you start to pursue county high pointing. County high pointing is much different. Many of these county high points are not very scenic. They're located in flat parts of the country, and many times even the owner of the property has no idea that they own the highest spot in their county. Here are 2 ranchers in western Nebraska that I visited several years ago. In each case, these gentlemen did not know that the high point was located on their ranches. They were sort of thrilled that this old professor from Michigan wanted to go out and stand on their high point, and so they went out and stood on the high point while I snapped their pictures. But notice that if we didn't have the pictures of these gentlemen or the headings on the bottom of these photos, how would you know that you're looking at the high point of Hayes County and not Greenlee County? It is very difficult to do county high pointing in the Midwest or in flat parts of the country. Things are not a whole lot better here in Michigan. Notice my clipboard leaning against my walking pole. These are the county high points in Iron County and Alger County in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. In order to find county high points, you have to do a lot of research before you can leave your house and head out into the woods. And you're going to need to use topographic maps and a GPS unit to help you do this. There are 3 things you need to establish before you leave your home. Number 1, how many possible high point candidates are there for this county? Are each of these contours natural, or are they artificial or altered in some way? And finally, do you have a latitude and longitude reading for each one of these contours? So when you're out in the field and you're wandering around out in the woods, you can use your GPS to know whether you're standing in the right spot or not. Here is a topographical map that shows 2 1,400-foot contours. The USGS in this particular map only draws a contour in 20-foot intervals. That means there could be up to a 19-foot rise inside one of these contours. Thus, you should visit both of these contours unless someone has established which one is higher. In this case, the government has done this work for us. You'll notice that the upper one has BM 1416 with a little triangle. That means that there is a permanent marker that's been established here, and the USGS figured out that the elevation is 1,416 feet, a 16-foot rise in that contour. You'll notice that there's another 1,400-foot contour to the south, and there's a small X with a 1410 written there. The surveyor also went down there, did what we call a spot check elevation, but didn't put a permanent marker in there and said this one's actually 6 feet lower than the other one. So, if these are the 2 contours that represent the highest potential spots in this county, We would only need to visit the northerly one because that one's been established to be the higher of the two. But things are not always that easy. Here's an example of a section in Indiana where there are six tiny 770-foot contours, all kind of in a row. You'll notice that they're located on the map right next to something that says sand pit. And so it makes me suspicious immediately that even though this is the highest contour, these are the highest contours, it makes me wonder whether these are simply debris piles or leftover sand from some former sand mining operation. You won't know unless you go out there and visually inspect that to determine whether whether these rises are real or artificial. Another example. Here is a map on the left and an identical map on the right where I've colored in the fact that there are 17 800-foot contours. I've colored them in purple so you can see them a little better. Now, for each one of these, you'll need to go out and you'll need to evaluate them and see, is there a bigger rise in some of them than in others? How will I know whether I'm even in the right spot? You won't know unless you've got a latitude and longitudinal reading that represents each one of these contours. Otherwise, you're just wandering around in the woods. Here is another example in Tipton County, Indiana. This area is located between Kokomo and Indianapolis and is an extremely flat part of the state of Indiana. Much of this land has been plowed year after year after year, and over time there has been erosion and rain and wind, and as I said, continual plowing, which has smoothed out these contours quite a bit. Normally, you'd spend most of your time looking at areas 1 and 16 to try to find the highest rise within these areas, but what may surprise you is the highest contour is actually number 13. Notice the little black square and the two little white squares. This is a farmhouse and outbuildings, and the land around these buildings has never been plowed. Thus, if you lay flat in the grass with your hand level and sight out across these fields, you'll discover that you're 2 to 3 feet higher than any of these other contours. Now that we've had our tutorial on topographic maps, let's take a look at Berrien County in Michigan. If you go to the southern part of this county, south of Buchanan, along Curran Road, you'll notice this small green circle and a small triangle within. This indicates that the government has indeed set a benchmark here. Benchmark Bertrand was set in 1877 at 938 feet above sea level. If you are very courteous and polite and you contact the property owner, Susan LIDAR, she may decide to let you into this area, in which case this is what you will see. You'll see a sign that warns not to disturb the marker that's shot full with holes from someone practicing with their shotgun. And if you poke around in the leaves, you may be able to uncover the actual benchmark that's in the lower left. And you'll also find at least 2 reference marks. In this case, these reference marks are little granite squares with US emblazoned on the top. Now, each one has a vector or an arrow on them. And if you follow where the arrows cross, they always cross right over the top of where the original benchmark is located. I guess that's so that you can locate where the mark should be in case it got disturbed or it's covered with 3 feet of snow or whatever. We're going to now talk about a town, Lincoln Township in Michigan. And the high spot in Lincoln Township is over in the Grand Mere State Park. It's a couple of sand dunes right along the edge of Lake Michigan. In 1970, the maps on the lower left indicated that there were 2 sand dunes, Bald Top, the upper one, at 760 feet, and an unnamed dune slightly higher in the woods at 770 feet. However, in the intervening years, we've had much improved technology. LIDAR surveys were done in 2016, and from these surveys, much more impressive renderings were made, as are illustrated on the right. The only unfortunate thing about these renderings, which are, by the way, drawn in 1 meter contours, is that they do not indicate what the elevation rings are. So you have to be very careful in the evaluation process. However, it is clear by looking at these newer maps that while the lower dune is still 770 feet above sea level, remember it's in the woods and so the dune is stable, that the northernmost dune, Bald Top, has grown from 760 feet in 1970 to 779 feet in 2016. And this is attributable to the fact that this dune has a large blowout or open area where the winds constantly carry sand up the dune and deposit it on the lee side of the top of the dune, patching in the brush and trees there. And over the years, this dune has grown an additional 19 feet in the last 40 some years. Let us return to some county high points where there's no question where the high point is located. Let's visit Ouray County in Colorado. Mount Sneffels is a very challenging 14,000-foot peak to climb. Here's one of my favorites in Oregon, South Sister, which is the high point of both Lane County and Deschutes County. And, from this vantage point, and this was shot in July, you can see 6 other uh, volcanic peaks with snow on them. And there's my kids once again practicing their snow climbing skills down below. My friend Mike and I were in Vermont several years ago visiting the Washington County High Point on Camel's Hump. And what's interesting about this picture is you'll notice the cairn on the right. That's the actual high point of Washington County. That's the high point, but yet that's the lower hump of the two. The county line goes right through the hole between the two humps on the top of the mountain. And so Mike is actually standing in a different county, which has a different mountain, which is even higher than this one. When I did some high pointing in Wales, I went to Holyhead Mountain, but was confronted with this sign in the upper left, which is written in Welsh, which I had no idea whether it said I was trespassing or not. So I kept going down the road, and about a kilometer or so down the road, I found another sign that was similarly marked, but in English that indicated private land, but right of way was granted if you didn't mind competing with the horses, goats, and dogs that are running freely. So I went back to where that first sign was, parked, and had no problem hiking up Mount Holyhead and observing the ferries going back and forth across the Irish Sea to Ireland. In England, there's Leith Hill, Surrey County High Point. Everyone says, oh, the high point is there where this Earl built his tower. And no, the actual answer is this slight little rock next to this little bench is actually a little bit higher, and that's the true high point in Surrey County. What's interesting about Surrey County is just down the hill another kilometer is an estate where Charles Darwin did a lot of his early experiments with worms, of all things, when he was developing his theories of evolution. England has some interesting terrain to visit. Here's Berkshire County in England, and it's sheep country. And these are in what they call the Chalk Hills. And I'll show you another one. Here is Wiltshire County, which is also in the Chalk Hills. You'll notice there's no real trees or anything. There are chalk deposits maybe a foot below the surface of this ground. Chalk is impervious to water. The roots of trees have a very hard time growing in it. And so as a result, you have this interesting landscape where there are no trees. A couple of 100 years ago, some enterprising peasants went out and scraped the dirt off the side hill and made some artwork. Here's an example of a huge horse where they simply scraped the dirt off to reveal the chalk underneath. And this horse is like 50 or 60 feet high and maybe 100, 120 feet long. and you hike along a trail right above the top of this thing on your way to Milk Hill, which is that tiny little bump up on the upper left. Perhaps you're interested in urban high pointing. Here are examples of two of the 5 county boroughs in the city of New York: Manhattan on the lower left and Brooklyn on the right. What's interesting is the high point in Brooklyn, just down the hill a little bit to the left, is a large monument that indicates this is where George Washington set up his cannon in an attempt to drive the British out of New York City during the Revolutionary War. Here are several Midwest County high points that are worth visiting: a cemetery in Christian County, Illinois, a gazebo in Lapeer County, Michigan, and a bald knob in Union County, Illinois. There are also restrictions when it comes to county high pointing. The county high point colored in blue in Martin County, Indiana, is located inside the Crane Naval Weapons Depot. I had the misfortune of inquiring about visiting this high point just a few months after the 9/11 thing occurred in New York City. And this is a storage point where they keep napalm and rockets and all manner of stuff for the Navy. It took me 5 months to get through all the government clearances. They went through my car like they thought I was smuggling drugs out of Mexico. And I was accompanied by a representative who made sure I took no pictures of anything in and out of there. All along the way, we saw bunkers that were hidden in the woods with munitions of different kinds stored within. Another restricted site is Mount Twombly in Macomb County, Michigan. This small mountain is located inside the Ford Proving Grounds. Since Ford is testing all sorts of new and experimental vehicles there, they are very protective, and it takes quite a bit of negotiation before I was allowed to visit. On the appointed day, I was assigned to a test driver who took me to the top, but insisted that the only picture I could take was next to this sign. Several roads and tracks have been constructed up this hill, including one that has a 60-degree slope. They use this grade to evaluate the vehicles that they build for the military. The driver then took me around their 2.5-mile track in his souped-up vehicle at a modest 130 miles an hour. This was the fastest I'd ever gone in a car until I went to Germany several years later. Yes, you'll find all kinds of unusual county high points. Typically, if you're going to do county high pointing in the Midwest, you've got to do it when there are no crops out there so you can see where the high ground is located. This picture on the lower left could be anywhere of a dozen different places in Iowa. On the right, you'll see Clark Mountain, Wayne County High Point in Missouri. This is considered one of the more challenging ones to visit in Missouri because it's on top of this giant rock. And the way that I got up there was I tied a rope to a tree and threw it over the top with loops. And that way I had protection when I went up. This is the easiest way of getting up the rock, by the way. Sometimes you'll find some very unusual places. Here's Forsyth County's High Point in Georgia. This flying saucer type house where the lady of the house did allow me to visit the high point, which is just behind where this house is located. There are all kinds of county high points. The Nantucket Light in Massachusetts was moved because the bank kept eroding. The ocean kept eroding the high bank there, and so they had to move the whole lighthouse about 100 feet to keep it from falling in. A lot of the high points that you visit, though, may look like this one on the right. This is Benchmark Reno, which is the high point in Washington, D.C., which is considered a county equivalent. If you're interested in doing state high pointing, you will automatically visit more than 50 county high points, and you can see where these counties are located in which these state high points are located. This is my personal county high points map. According to the website peakbagger.com, as of April 2025, I have successfully visited 2,409 county high points. regardless of the color, green, yellow, or blue. If it's a colored in county, I've visited that county high point. Maybe you're not really into a lot of exertion. Maybe you'd like to just simply keep track of how many counties have I visited. There's a whole separate group out there called the Extra Milers Club that you can simply color in the county if you've set foot in the county. And that might be a fun thing to do if you've got kids and you're traveling across the country, and it'll give them something to do to keep track of how many counties have you been located in. I don't really know what kind of hobby you're interested in, but I did discover when I was out in eastern Colorado, when you come to the fork in the road, do you remember Johnny Carson always talking about the fork in the road? I actually found the fork in the road. Look at this. I went left. I went toward the high ground. There's a ranch up this road about 8 miles known as the Bledsoe Ranch. And when I met Mr. Bledsoe, he proudly announced to me that he was the uncle of Drew Bledsoe, the former quarterback for the New England Patriots, who got hurt. And as a result of his injury, Tom Brady had his first chance to play professional football. Visit a high point somewhere. Take a picture. Now, this is the only picture of a mountain in any of this collection that I haven't been on the top of. No, I have not been on the top of the Matterhorn. But I am currently in this picture standing at the Gornergrat, which is the high point of Visp County in the Valais Canton in Switzerland. You can get a great picture. Visit a high point somewhere. A high point adventure, you'll meet interesting people. You'll learn lots of local history. You'll see some natural beauty, and you'll visit some roads that very few people drive on. Try it. You may enjoy it. The end.